So I've been noticing a generational trend of particularly Gen Zers responding to stressful life events by taking mental health days, kind of foregoing any and all responsibilities, and doing something called bed rotting. If you're not familiar with bed rotting, allow me to just briefly define it. The practice of spending many hours in bed during the day, often with snacks or an electronic device, as a voluntary retreat from activity or stress. A phrase from social media wherein a person stays in bed for the entire day without engaging in daily activities and chores.
There are a lot of things in life I'm passionate about, but I think I'm most passionate about my rotting days. I need to have a rotting day at least once a week. Twice would be nice because I just need to recharge my batteries. Rotting is an Olympic sport, and when I rot, do not ask me to get out of bed. Do not ask me to do anything. When I say I'm rotting, I'm rotting.
I am actually not interested in being the best version of myself today. I instead would like to rot.
Now, I'm kind of tackling two topics in one here, mental health days and bed rotting. Which is a generational trend, particularly among Gen Zers, of responding to life stressors by kind of dropping everything. I gotta be honest with you, I'm a little bit skeptical as to whether this trend is actually good for one's mental health, whether it's actually an effective self-care strategy. So today, let's talk about it. Okay, so allow me to explain why I don't think that bed rotting is very healthy. Now, we can address bed rotting from three different perspectives. One is that it could be a symptom of an actual mental illness like depression. Another one is it's a behavior that sometimes people do when they're going through a really hard time and need a mental health day. And a third option is that it's just a ritualized part of the week. It doesn't necessarily signal to a person that they have some sort of emotional difficulty going on, but just something that they've made part of their routine, kind of like some of the TikToks that I showed. So if you're a person who's struggling with their mental health, if you have something like depression, lying in bed all day and being unable to function is kind of like what your body already gravitates to. And if you're in therapy, that's probably the kind of thing that you would target as a treatment goal of your therapy plan. It's not really something that a therapist would encourage you to lean into if this is a frequent habit of yours. Instead, they would probably challenge you to implement techniques like behavioral activation, which behavioral activation is meant to actually help people get out of bed when they're feeling depressed and doing things that make them feel confident and things that make them feel pleasurable. So for instance, if you really enjoy gardening, forcing yourself to go outside and garden once a day, or if you feel really good about yourself when you finish a book, forcing yourself to read 10 pages every day. It doesn't feel good. It doesn't come natural to a lot of people who have more of a predisposition towards depression, but that is the treatment. The treatment is ultimately the opposite of what your impulse tells you to do. Or if you're in something like DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, the foundation of emotion regulation in DBT is handling very basic things like, are you moving your body every day? Are you drinking enough water? Are you staying away from addictions, which does include electronics as well? Are you socializing? Are you eating healthy? So these are things that you would be actively trying to challenge rather than lean into if you already have some sort of mental struggle or something that you're dealing with that you need to cope with. But even if that's not your everyday life, or even if that's not your typical go-to predisposition, pushing away any and all responsibilities is, I think, kind of a dubious self-care method. Sometimes if you're going through a big stressor, self-care might be throwing yourself into all your responsibilities because it gives you a sense of purpose and meaning. When you feel like everything in your personal life, for instance, is going up in flames, throwing yourself into work can really stabilize you for that period until you're strong enough to really look at your personal issues in the face. Or I know people who used to have really significant mental health struggles until they got a job that they were very invested in, because the job gives them a sense of purpose even when things aren't going ideally in their personal life. Throwing yourself into your responsibilities can also help keep your mind occupied so that you don't ruminate and obsess over things that are bothering you. So if you have more of a tendency towards obsessive thinking, taking away any and all distractions and responsibilities might actually make things worse for you. If you're feeling really anxious about, let's say, a health symptom that you have, let's say that you have illness anxiety, quitting all your responsibilities for the day to lie in bed and obsess over this is probably the worst thing that you could do. And also, if you're continuing to achieve your goals and to support yourself while you're going through something difficult, it can actually be an act of self-care, because if you start to slack in your other areas of life, you're going to end up feeling even more stressed. Then you're going to have the initial stressor, and then the other stressors created by not being able to engage with your responsibilities, like getting a bad grade, getting fired from a job, or getting demoted, or losing friends. So as for this third reason for bed rotting, where it's just a routine, it's not really to cope with anything in particular. Again, I have some doubts as to whether this is healthy. And as I was reflecting on this topic, I realized that I actually did something kind of like bed rotting, more like couch rotting. Every time I would get back from work a few years ago, I was so exhausted I didn't have the energy to do anything but just sit in front of the TV and binge watch something for hours, at first with dinner and then just passively sitting there and watching. And as soon as I cut that out of my routine, I became a much happier person. My illness anxiety all but was nipped in the bud. I don't really experience that dread for no reason in the evenings because I've replaced TV watching with reading, which is something a lot more active. So for me, I can definitely say that rotting in front of the TV was detrimental for my anxiety. But I think a more important question we need to ask ourselves is, why do we feel so exhausted in day-to-day life that our only idea of recharging is doing something extremely passive, where we don't even have the energy for anything else? And does actually doing that help us cope? My opinion is no. I don't think that a state of total inactivity and rest can really fully help you cope. I think that active coping is a lot more beneficial. Bed rotting can also really worsen sleep-wake cycles. It can really mess with your circadian rhythm, and any sort of therapist who works with sleep disorders will tell you that you should ideally only ever use your bed for sleeping. You cannot associate it with anything else, because then unconsciously your mind is going to form that association that, oh, bed is just for hanging out, bed is just for scrolling in bed, it's not for sleeping. So it can lead to things like insomnia. It can also worsen depression and anxiety, and it can be even harder to initiate activity after this, because an object at rest will remain at rest. You don't gain momentum by doing nothing, you gain momentum by initiating an activity. And not to mention, I think that bed rotting as a practice is super individualistic, because it can have a really detrimental effect on the people around you as well. If you're a spouse or a parent, you know that you can't really afford to bed rot, because there are other people that are dependent on you that you're responsible for, that you need to show up for. So if you don't want to put an undue burden on your spouse or to be a neglectful parent, you don't get to just say no responsibilities at all for a day. That's kind of a privilege that most people don't have. Of course, it can burden your coworkers if you're always canceling and they have to pick up the slack for you, whether it means taking on more shifts or absorbing your responsibilities at work. Same with your classmates. And it can make you a worse friend if you're constantly not showing up for people, canceling plans, not being responsive to them. Now, look, I'm not going to say that bed rotting is never a healthy choice, because I don't actually believe that. I do think that there are some specific situations where bed rotting might be an act of self-care and actually self-love for a person. If you're physically sick and you need to rest in order to recover, or you can't really function, if you're mentally or physically sick to the point where you just cannot do anything that day, overexerting yourself is not going to help. Or if you're a person who typically does the very opposite, if you're like me, if you have what's called a manic defense mechanism where you constantly need to go, then taking a mental health day, taking a day to rot in bed might actually be a challenge in self-compassion and a challenge to rest for once. And it's interesting, in the literature, there's something called absenteeism, when people go missing from school or work. But what I learned is that there's also something called presenteeism, which is when you show up to work while sick. And that's not good either, because if you're genuinely too sick to work, and that includes mentally, emotionally, you're going through too much to be able to work, then that's actually predictive of long-term absenteeism, because that shit accumulates. And then eventually you're going to burn out and you're going to take even a bigger step backwards than the people who occasionally took mental health days when they needed them. So again, I think people who overexert themselves and push themselves too hard, taking a day to rot in bed might be an act of self-care for them. Also, if you're in like the very, very early stages of an emotion, before you've mustered the strength to move on or to regulate or to cope in any way, it can be helpful to process through that emotion rather than throwing yourself in something else. So if you just like lost a loved one, for instance, taking a mental health day to mourn them and to just sit in bed all day and cry can be a good thing. That can be helpful. But of course, it has to, at some point, be followed by more active coping strategies and emotion regulation, unless you want to be trapped in that spot forever. So what I'm saying is, like, I don't think it's a one and done thing. Bed rotting, mental health days are never the option. I think they are sometimes the right choice for people. And I think in moderation, we should take mental health days just as we take sick days when we need them. But we've been hearing a lot of reports about how Gen Z is really struggling to adjust to work and just not really showing up reliably for their coworkers, for their bosses. So I get the feeling that this is a phenomenon that is being taken a little bit to an extreme. And I'm going to give you some questions to kind of help you figure out whether it's worth taking a mental health day in your specific circumstance, and whether bed rotting is a healthy choice for you, as well as some healthier alternatives if you deem that that's not the case. But before I go into that, I'd love to tell you about today's sponsor, Akiflow. Particularly if you're a person who struggles to stay productive while your mental health is slacking, Akiflow can be a really valuable tool for you. Akiflow is a time-blocking platform that allows you to streamline task scheduling, maximize productivity, minimize procrastination, and put all of your tools in one spot, in one calendar. As you can see, this is my schedule for the next couple of days, and it's a very intuitive interface. Everything is easily modifiable. You can duplicate something if you need it and then drag it to another day. You can easily delete something. You can add something on your task list on the left and then drag it into a slot, or you can just put it straight into the slot. It's very, very intuitive to use. And lately they have a lot of really cool new features. For example, there's an AI feature that automatically assigns your tasks to projects so that you don't even have to be the one to do that. There's also a new statistics feature where you can see how you're using up your time and how to be more efficient. There's also a new share availability feature that kind of works like Calendly. And Akiflow also has a lot of other really cool highlights, like for instance, if you go to integrations, you can integrate a bunch of apps, whatever you're using, Gmail, Slack, Zoom, so that again, everything is just in one spot. You don't have to go looking for it in different places. You can use the command bar to access Akiflow from anywhere on your computer, and you can personalize how you want to use the command bar. You can easily organize tasks into tags or labels. You can prioritize certain tasks to keep them at the forefront. And you also have the rituals button, which helps you sort of decompress from what you did that day or the day before, and then also start on the next day. And you also get one-on-one productivity coaching and an onboarding call. So check them out using the link below. Thank you so much to Akiflow for sponsoring this portion of today's video. Now, putting aside bed rotting for just a moment, let's revisit the concept of mental health days. I wanted to look at who is more vulnerable to taking mental health days. In an Australian study that looked at 5,000 nurses and midwives, it was found that people who take mental health days tend to be younger, tend to be smokers, tend to be people with a mental health diagnosis, tend to be less productive because of mental struggles. Now, there are kind of two ways of looking at this. One is to say, okay, the people who take mental health days are the ones who need them the most, right? Or the other way of looking at it might be mental health days are not really helping people cope in the way that we hope they are. Obviously, this is correlational, so we don't actually know what the causality looks like, but it's an interesting preliminary study. I thought it was interesting that younger people tend to be more prone to taking mental health days. And on one hand, I think this is kind of a good thing because in my generation, we have more of a push towards prioritizing mental health and valuing mental health the same way that we would value any other aspect of our health. But then sometimes I wonder, when I see how many mental health days some people in my generation take, I do stop and wonder, why is it the people who are less productive rather than the people who have the most on their plate the ones that take mental health days. And I think it really boils down to this. Is it that you can't get out of bed or go to work that day, or that you don't want to? I think in a lot of situations, people are now taking mental health days and bed rotting in situations where they really can't function that day. And that's good. But I'm also seeing the other option as well. A lot of people, like the ones I showed, who are basically ritualizing bed rotting for fun and normalizing absolute passivity to the point where it's almost a vegetative state. This is basically normalizing doing nothing when you are in fact fully capable of doing something. So here's a framework to kind of help you figure out whether it's worth taking a mental health day and or bed rotting. First, I want you to ask yourself, are you functional today? If you're genuinely not functional today, there is no point in forcing yourself to be. You're only going to overexert yourself and burn yourself out. If you truly cannot concentrate on your responsibilities, if you can't do anything without bursting into tears, if you cannot complete everyday tasks, depending on what industry you're in too, it might be dangerous for you to go into work. It might be irresponsible for you to go into work. It's the equivalent of needing a sick day for your mind. Take the sick day, because forcing yourself now will only lead to burnout. But, and this is where it's really important to be honest with yourself, if you could do your responsibilities and you just don't really feel like it, let's go on to the next question. Question number 2 is, at the end of the day, if you went about your responsibilities, would you feel better about yourself? I know that for me, the answer is almost always yes. Would you feel a sense of competence and self-pride that you powered through a really difficult day? Would you be glad you pushed through because you really needed the money or you really needed to keep up a good impression at work? Would you be glad that you had something else to focus on because otherwise you'd probably be ruminating and in a really bad headspace at home? Would getting up, getting dressed, making yourself presentable, putting on a fake smile maybe make you feel better? And science suggests that most often the answer is yes. Actually, our mind follows our body's biofeedback cues. So if our body is acting functional and happy, we tend to trick our mind into thinking that as well. Would interacting with other people make you feel better? Usually the answer is yes. So if the answer to these questions is yes, then maybe it would be better for you to power through, to go about your day, to not forego any and all responsibilities. But if the answer to all of these questions is no, let's go on to the next question. What is a greater act of self-care for you? Pushing through when things get hard, or resting when you need it? And this is really going to depend on your historical patterns. If you're a person who historically takes a lot of mental health days or tends to throw responsibilities to the wayside when the going gets tough, I'm going to be honest with you, probably a greater act of self-care for you to challenge yourself to do the very opposite. If on the other hand, you're a person who never lets yourself rest, who always powers through, then taking a day off might genuinely be an act of radical self-love for you. So I hope these questions helped you figure out, do I take a mental health day or not, based on your specific circumstances and your subjective impression of what's going on with you. Let's assume that the answers to all these questions yield yes, it's an act of self-care to take a mental health day. Now let's decide whether bed rotting is an appropriate strategy to use on that mental health day. And this is where we're going to borrow from DBT a little bit. Number 1, what emotion are you feeling? Number 2, does this emotion fit the facts? Whether an emotion fits the facts depends on what the emotion is. So anger, for instance, fits the facts when an injustice has occurred. Sadness fits the facts when you've lost something important to you. Happiness fits the facts when something good has happened to you. If you want a breakdown of this emotion regulation strategy, you can find it in the Personal Growth Journal. That will really walk you through this more in depth. Let's say that you're feeling sad because you lost a family member. Does that fit the facts? Yes, of course, it fits the facts to be sad when you've lost somebody important to you. What about if you're feeling anxious because you flunked a test? Yes, it makes sense to feel anxious about the future of your schooling. Versus feeling sad because your sister got a promotion at work? No, that doesn't really fit the facts. There's probably some sort of cognitive distortion behind that. Feeling anxious because you're worried you might have cancer, even though you went to the doctor and they told you there is nothing to suggest you have cancer. No, again, that emotion does not fit the facts. And if your emotion doesn't fit the facts, bed rotting is most definitely not going to help you. You probably should still examine what's causing that emotion, process through it, journal it, talk about it in therapy, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend rotting in bed over it. Moving on to question number 3. Is it effective to act on this emotion with this emotion urge? So every emotion has an emotion urge associated with it. And this might look different for different people. If you're feeling angry, one person might have the urge to fight, the other might have the person to flee. So if, for example, you're feeling sad because you just lost your family member, would it get you closer to your goals to rot in bed for a day? Honestly, it might. Yeah, it might help you process through that initial stage of grief. Or if you're feeling anxious because you flunked a test, is it effective to act on the urge to sit in bed all day and ruminate? No. Losing another day of school would definitely not meet your goals. So if you've determined my emotion fits the facts, it's effective to act upon, and my emotion urge is to rot in bed all day, go right ahead. Just give yourself a specific time limit, whether it's a few hours or a day or whatever. But if your emotion either does not fit the facts of the situation or isn't effective to act upon, probably your best bet is to do the very opposite of the emotion urge, what's called the opposite action in DBT. So if your urge is to bed rot, you're going to instead do something completely productive and active that will help you regulate your emotion. Something like meditating, something like exercising, journaling, calling up a friend, socializing, exposing yourself to nature, going for a walk, going for a hike, going for kayaking, whatever it is. So I hope that this framework helped you kind of navigate. Do I take a mental health day? Do I rot in bed? What is healthiest for me? At the end of the day, you know yourself best. I don't know you. I don't know what's best for you. You can figure that out if you're just really honest with yourself. I hope this video was helpful. Don't forget to check out Akiflow, and I will see you soon.